Welcome everyone to the process of healing. I got an email a couple of weeks ago introducing me to Dr. David Clark. And in the email, it said that Dr. David Clark focuses on the psychology behind chronic pain. And immediately I had 100 questions. But before I get started on all those, Dr. Clark, please introduce yourself.
Thank you so much for having me on your program, David. I am a physician. I'm double board certified in gastroenterology and internal medicine. And for about the last 40 years, I have been focusing on people who had no biological explanation for their symptoms. They had real pain or real illness, but no disease or injury to explain it. And I would, for two-thirds of my patients, do all the diagnostic tests and find something that explained their condition. But for a third of them, the diagnostic tests did not show why they were ill or in pain. And that began a journey of trying to understand their stress, trauma, unexpressed emotions, other challenges in life. And when we could understand what was going on with those and bring them into conscious awareness, we could help people get better, sometimes fairly quickly, even after years and sometimes decades of illness.
Wow, I'm so impressed to hear that. I know that so many people have horror stories from experiences they've had with something in the medical field. And to hear, even in just those few lines of you speaking of the way that you spoke, shows me that you do care and that you do believe. And if someone says that there's something there, you want to figure out why. And I think that is so important. Sometimes I feel things, but I don't know how to describe it or pinpoint where the pain is or where it came from. And so sometimes I feel like it's not taken seriously.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's all too true. I was taught very traditional Western education and medicine that if you've got pain or illness, there's got to be a disease or injury behind it. And sometimes we physicians, we try like crazy to make somebody's symptoms fit into a box that we understand, that
Sure.
there's some kind of physical abnormality that's behind it. But it turns out there's this whole other category, which my colleagues and I now call neuroplastic symptoms, neuro for brain and nervous system. Plastic is the jargon term for a capacity for change, which is good news because it means these symptoms can actually get better. But these neuroplastic symptoms are generated in the brain. There are studies that have scanned people's brains with this condition and found that they are anatomically different. The circuits that are up here are actually different in a whole range of different neuroplastic conditions. But it's also, we're beginning to find that with the right kind of psychology and neuroplastic psychology, we can turn these things around. We can actually change the circuits in the brain and people get dramatically better. And that's what's the most new concept in our field is these clinical trials that have now been done across North America. One of the first was done in Boulder, Colorado, of people with back pain for an average of 10 years. And they went through neuroplastic psychology, and their back pain decreased by 75% in 4 weeks. And again, these are people with an average of 10 years of back pain, 4 weeks, 2 sessions a week, 1 hour per session for 4 weeks, total of 8 hours of neuroplastic psychology treatment, 75% decrease in their pain. And it was sustained. They followed them up, watched them for almost a year to see did the pain come back, and it did not. And to make it even more rigorous, they had two control groups who did not get the neuroplastic psychology. One just got their usual doctor's care. The other group got a big injection into the spine, which has a pretty powerful placebo effect, as you might guess. And those two control groups really didn't change significantly at all. They just pretty much stayed in as much pain as they'd always been. So there was this huge difference between the neuroplastic psychology group and the other two groups in terms of their outcomes. And that study it got published in a prestigious journal, the American Medical Association Psychiatry Journal. It got national publicity. It unlocked millions of dollars for follow-up research. It has totally changed the field around. And now we're getting studies from Halifax, Harvard, Detroit, UCLA that are confirming the same thing. We are on the verge of a revolution in how pain is treated.
Uh, th- that makes me so happy. Do you mind if I ask, what role do you think the mental health aspects of things plays into actual physical pain, the chronic pain in the body?
Yeah, that's the surprising thing is just how powerful that is. I think most of us are familiar with the physical reactions that we have in response to emotions of one sort or another. In other words, if we're embarrassed, you know, our face might turn red. If we're in a tense situation, we're about to ask somebody out on a date for the first time, or we've got a big job interview coming up, or we're about to go into a competition where we want to win, we may get a knot in our abdomen. We may feel those butterflies in the stomach in one of those situations. That's a physical reaction to an emotional situation. And those are very common human experience. Everybody's had those. And this form of illness, where it reaches the level of pain or illness, is just a more severe form of that. But the brain has always been connected to the body. Emotions have always had a physical manifestation. This is just a more severe form of that. And consequently, it's the emotions involved often reach the level of trauma. Somebody that's been through a horrifying or terrifying experience, or they went through a lot of seemingly less severe experiences, particularly as a child, that can play out into all kinds of impacts that carry on well into the adult years. But the good news is all of those things can be addressed. We can help people to become consciously aware of those things that are going on and make changes. But the level of severity of this, it shocked me. Traditionally trained guy that I am, I didn't think the brain could do this, but my very first patient was averaging one bowel movement per month, despite taking four different laxatives at double the recommended doses every day. Another patient of mine had pain for 79 years, and she was a nurse, so she had very good access to health care. Didn't help until we found what the trauma was. Another patient I was asked to see on her 70th day in the hospital, getting morphine in massive doses around the clock for unexplained abdominal pain. Another patient had been hospitalized at a prestigious university 60 times in 15 years for attacks of severe dizziness and vomiting. All of these patients were successfully treated with neuroplastic psychology, but it shows you just how ill you can get from this. I heard a patient, or I guess I should say, I read a patient's statement the other day that their long COVID or chronic fatigue couldn't possibly be connected to any kind of mental process because the symptoms were just too severe. This person had been terribly debilitated for 3 or 4 years. But that just isn't true. The brain can absolutely do this to people.
Oh yeah, I definitely believe that. There's so many things happening inside my head right now. There's someone that I'm very close to, like the patient you were speaking of, that would have one bowel movement in a month. She had half of her intestine removed, enough to where she did not have to have one of the colostomy bags. But her next surgery is going to be that because this didn't do it, did nothing. And
Yeah, I can't diagnose that person
sure.
over the television here or the internet here, but yeah, it's possible that there is a stress behind it. On our website, symptomatic.me, we've got a 12-question quiz, takes less than 3 minutes, and it's set up in a way that the more questions to which you answer yes, the more likely it is that you've got a neuroplastic process responsible for your symptoms. Doesn't obviously diagnose it, but it can at least give you some ideas. Every single question has a line or two of explanation of what a yes answer means and gives you additional areas to explore and suggest that some of the resources we have on the website might be of benefit to you. There's certainly no harm in looking into this. If you have a biological problem, an organ disease, or structural damage, there's going to be no harm from looking into this.
Yeah. I always say that if my lungs were hurt, I would see a lung doctor. If my ears hurt, I would see an ear doctor. If my brain is ill, I should see a therapist. But there can also be more to it than that. But there's such a stigma that comes with if your brain is ill, there's such a stigma that comes with it, and people fear of that. And so I think that people stop. I think there's a wall or some kind of divide where people, as soon as they hear therapy or your brain is ill, maybe there's some kind of mental something there's this wall that comes up that blocks people from really looking further into, sometimes it can be more than just therapy. There are other options out there.
Yeah, it's a very common stigma, as you point out. And unfortunately, a lot of healthcare professionals learn the same thing, that if you've got pain or illness, but it's not caused by disease or injury, then it's all in your head. You're just somebody who's mentally not very strong. You can't handle your own stress. There's no way to diagnose you. We can't make you better. You're just going to have to live with this. And it turns out that every single one of those myths is false. My patients who have this condition are actually mentally stronger than average. It's just that they're carrying a burden of stress that's far bigger than usually even they themselves recognize. I make the analogy that they're like Olympic weightlifters that are carrying a load of stress that's 50 pounds bigger than the world record for their weight class. And if we can just show them what that weight is and enable them to put the weight down, then they realize that they've actually been very strong people all the way along, that there is a diagnosis for this condition, is a successful treatment available, and that it will not only alleviate their physical symptoms, but it changes their lives. Their relationships get healthier, more balanced, less toxic. Their ability to take care of themselves, find activities that are joyful for them, the ability to express emotions that they didn't know were there before, the ability to set boundaries around toxic people in their lives so that they won't be causing so much stress for them in the future. All kinds of ripple effects from neuroplastic psychology that, frankly, for me, made it so rewarding to do because I was accomplishing more than just the physician's goal of relieving symptoms. I was seeing people's lives change from this.
I love that you're saying this. It truly means a lot to me, and it's given me some hope. So, a little backstory on me: my big T, my big trauma happened 9 years ago. And someone broke inside my home and raped me and beat me until they
Oh,
thought they had killed me. A couple hours later, they wrecked their car and they were covered in blood, but it was my blood and not theirs. So they confessed to murder. And it took them 18 hours to find me. When they did, I was luckily still alive, but it was 18 hours of brain injury, lack of oxygen. I had temporary amnesia. There were so many things I didn't remember, even like who my mom and my grandmother was when they showed up at the hospital. Luckily, that was pretty short lived. There's a lot that I don't remember, which is common with trauma, but luckily for the most part of the things that happened before and after the trauma, I was able to remember. But during this time of recovery, I got down to 98 pounds and I was just sick. I was ill. I was depressed. I was having to face this guy in court, and my story was public and on the news, and there comes hate with that. The point of me saying all that about my weight and stuff is I found that when I was trying to bathe myself, I couldn't stand up in the shower and hold my head back and close my eyes. My equilibrium was off. I found that I was walking funny. I had no balance. And still to this day, I have that chronic back pain, those body elements and things that I just can't do. When I went to the emergency room, the doctor looked at me after I expressed what was going on with me. They told me that they know that I was there for drugs and that they were not going to feed my habit. They didn't bother looking at my medical because addiction runs in my family. And in the highest of my pain, I refused any kind of pain medication because I know how addiction runs. I'm terrified of it. In the height of my trauma, I accepted no pain medications. So I wasn't there for that. I was sick. I was hurting. And now it's just become my normal. I know when I'm going to fall down now. I know when my leg is going to give out. I know what I can and cannot do in the shower. I know how to, even on a romantic level with my partner in the bedroom, I know what I can and cannot do physically, but no one can find out why it's happening. And I've almost given up on it and thought this is going to be the rest of my life. This pain that I feel is so normal now. If you ask me how I'm doing, I'm going to tell you I feel good because this is my new normal. And so to hear you talk gives me some hope that I need to check into this. And I appreciate that.
Yeah, it can be very challenging, particularly in a situation like this, to know if what proportion of your symptoms is coming from damage to your body or your brain, and what proportion might be coming from the trauma itself, from the long-term mental health impacts of going through an experience like that. We oftentimes don't know until we treat a person for both of them what the relative contributions are. But I've seen countless patients who've been through a trauma where symptoms like this followed on and sometimes lasted for years. But the successful treatment of the post-traumatic stress alleviated the physical manifestations at the same time. And I've had patients that didn't get their physical symptoms right after the trauma, that there was a delay. The reason why the symptoms came on later is that there was some kind of a trigger. One of my patients had witnessed the shooting of her brother, and he had died in the ambulance. And she didn't have any symptoms physically immediately after that, but the man who shot her brother was arrested at the scene, convicted of manslaughter because the shooting took place in the context of a tavern brawl. And he served 8 or 9 years in prison. He was released, and nobody told her that he was out there. So she encountered him in a store. It came as a huge shock, and her physical symptoms began very soon after that. One of her symptoms was abdominal pain, and when I asked her to show me where the pain was, she formed her hand into this shape and pointed at the right lower corner of her abdomen, which turned out to be exactly the place where her brother suffered his bullet wound.
You know that
And she didn't, it was completely unconscious. She didn't know she was doing this. I just said, "Where is your pain?" She forms her hand into this shape, points at the right lower corner of her abdomen, and then find out later when it's routine for me to ask people about traumas they've been through. And she tells me about her brother, and I inquired about where the gunshot wound was, exactly the same place as her pain.
wow. And for the listeners, just so you all know, she made the finger thumb pointing like a gun, and what we would use as to symbolize a gun. That's what she used. I always get so impressed. Your body knows. There's just this muscle memory of things, and your body will tell you. And especially when you have someone that is trained like you to notice that. Because if she would have said, "I just hurt right here," and made that to me, I probably wouldn't have caught on to that. The training that you have, that's very powerful. That's very impressive.
Yeah, it was something I had to learn over the years. I was very lucky that in the 8th year of my training, I encountered this patient who was moving her bowels once a month and didn't think anything could possibly help her since every single test was normal. But I stumbled on the fact that she had been sexually assaulted by her father as a girl. She's 37 years old. She's been ill with this constipation. It seems trivial to call it constipation when you're moving your bowels once a month, but that's what she was doing. And she'd had that for 2 years. The sexual abuse from her father stopped when she was 12. So we were talking 25 years later that her illness had begun. And yet it turned out that trauma could also have this delayed impact. And it was when that was successfully treated by a psychiatrist at UCLA, where I was in training, that I first learned about this. I couldn't believe it. I ran into the psychiatrist in an elevator, made conversation, and said, just whatever happened to that patient I sent you? Patient was cured. I didn't think such a thing was possible, but that was how I got my start. That was the elevator ride that changed my career because I first found out that this kind of thing was even possible. So it carried on from there and learned how to ask these questions about trauma, learned how to watch for body language all along the way that might serve as clues to what was going on.
Yeah. That's so interesting. We hear in a lot of cases that people will say they'll become public in one way or another about their sexual assault. And it happened 30 years ago. And they're just remembering. And some people, it's very easy for us to victim blame because we don't know how to put ourselves in those shoes. So we're like, why didn't you say this 30 years ago? Does it even matter anymore? And of course, being a victim, I know that it still matters, regardless. Even if we set the whole judgmental stuff aside from it, what that does to your body and what your body holds on to with that is very damaging.
Yeah, there's no question. And it has effects even beyond that. It makes you feel unworthy in some way as a person that this happened to you. Why did the universe pick you out to have this happen to you? Same thing happened to my patient who was sexually assaulted by her father so many times, and so many other of my patients who went through what appears on the surface to be less severe trauma, but it can have similar long-term effects, particularly on your self-esteem and self-worth as a person. One of my patients, after talking to him for quite a while, where he said that his childhood had been fine, he eventually remembered that the only time he ever got any praise from his parents, any kind of emotional support, any time being made to feel good about himself, was when he did something better than his brothers and sisters could do it. But his brothers and sisters were very accomplished. He had three of them, three siblings, and they were all good at just about everything. It was very difficult for him to prove himself better than they were. As a consequence, he rarely got any kind of praise or support from his parents, came out of his early years just feeling close to worthless. And that turns out to be a critically important common denominator amongst everybody who went through adversity as children, whether you were sexually assaulted as my first patient, or whether you just came through without ever feeling like you amounted to anything. The long-term consequences of that, people trying to overcome these things, either the capital T trauma or the small t traumas, trying to overcome them as best they can as kids. They try to be perfect. They try to focus on the needs of everybody else. They try to solve all the problems that they see in front of them. They're highly self-critical of themselves. They tend to choose partners that are not very supportive. They tend to choose partners who need that perfectionism and support and constant giving that my patients used to cope when they were young. So they're very unbalanced relationships that people wind up in. So all of these things are highly stressful and can lead the brain into producing these symptoms in the body. So it's not only the horrible traumas that you went through and my sexual assault patient went through. It can be much more subtle, but in the long run have similar impacts.
Mm. I'm glad that you said that the way that you did. One of the things that ever since I started my podcast or sharing my story is I will never compare traumas. What happened to me is my big T, and it's the hardest thing that I've been through, but I cannot compare that to what your big T is. And because what I was finding was so common is people would say, "Oh, I know that you went through that, but I went through this," as if it was trying to minimize. And that was something that I never wanted to do. And so I'm so glad that you worded it the way that you did, because I think what comes with the comparisons of traumas is people for stop realizing what is actually a trauma. When you think of the gentleman you were speaking of that had that the competitive parents that wanted to compete with his siblings, when I say it that way, is that trauma? But to him and what he endured with that, absolutely. What his body remembers for, absolutely, that was traumatic for him, and it's
Yeah.
something his body remembers. And so I'm glad that you pointed that out, because trauma comes in all kinds of forms.
Yeah, it certainly does. If that patient who had the competitive siblings, if it only happened one day or once a year, obviously no big deal, but it was his entire life.
Right.
He was on a treadmill he never got off. He was constantly trying to prove himself day after day and failing day after day, which just left him feeling like he was never going to measure up no matter what he did. And that same energy and focus on trying to be perfect and being extremely self-critical, far more critical of himself whenever he made a mistake than he ever would be of a friend or colleague who made the same mistake. And choosing people for his romantic partners and close personal relationships that just they had issues, they had problems, they had needs, and he was there to supply them, to fix them, to give them whatever they needed. And he ended up in one relationship after another that was 95% giving and only 5% getting back. And by the time he was into his 30s, he was having physical symptoms all over his body.
Yeah. I would love your thoughts on this. I've spoken with people, and it's mostly the heterosexual white males that I have spoken with that I get the response to that I'm about to tell you. So I will ask them, what is your relationship to trauma? Have you ever, like, what would you consider your big T or small T? And their response is, I've not been traumatized. I've never went through anything bad. But then as the conversation progresses, they talk about their mom was bipolar, their dad was an alcoholic, they sometimes would not be at their baseball games or football games. Sometimes they had to skip their own games to go to their siblings' games. They had to let the neighbor teach them how to drive a car because the dad was gone and the mom was with her mental illness. They then had to teach their siblings how to drive a car. They were working three jobs while in school. And I'm like, dude, that is trauma.
Yeah, but it's they're looking back and none of us has a parallel life to compare with. So when we
Right.
look back, it just feels normal to us. If I was to respond to your question, I would have to say that this is, and I look at it as an intellectual disability in this field that I came from privilege. I remember a comment by the Texas Governor Ann Richards about George W. Bush that he was born on third base and thought he hit a triple. That was my life. When I first encountered people who had been through trauma, I had no personal experience I could bring to bear. I could not use my own recovery story from this as a source of knowledge to help other people. I was starting from absolute zero. And it's embarrassing to me as a physician that I had no training in this, that I could get all the way through 7+ years of education, really good Western traditional medicine education, and have absolutely no idea that childhood trauma, adult trauma could make you physically ill. It was absolutely ground zero for this. I was so grateful to Dr. Kaplan, the psychiatrist, who gave me the framework for this because I wanted to be a complete physician. I wanted to be able to handle whatever came through my door. I thought maybe I'll see a couple of patients a year like this and I should be ready. And then when they come in, I can talk to them and send them off to mental health. And that was just more ways in which I was wrong because it was 5 or 6 patients a week with this that without even trying, without even hanging out my shingle and saying, hey, I do this, it was just normal gastroenterology practice had 35% of patients with these neuroplastic symptoms in their bodies. And then when I sent them off to mental health, they got cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the prevailing form of psychotherapy in the US. It doesn't work very well for this. And we have research now that confirms this. You have to go a lot deeper than CBT to uncover the deeper underlying issues. So the patients would go off to mental health, and I thought, okay, I'm done with them. But then they would come back and they would say, I'm still got my symptoms because there was nobody doing what Dr. Kaplan was doing when I got to Portland, Oregon. And they said, what can we do? And I said, I don't know, but I'm going to do my best because I had this framework from Dr. Kaplan. And I really felt like a bumbling beginner. And I know if there were videos of me back in those days, they would be embarrassing to watch. But even as a beginner, I was getting decent results. People were starting to improve. They were getting better when the rest of the healthcare system was not helping them. And that was hugely encouraging. It was so rewarding professionally and personally as a physician to be able to do this for people. And so I carried on with it. And now we're 7,000 patients later.
I have so much respect for that. And I feel like there's so many double-edged swords, right? If someone has been completely traumatized, and even if they've nurtured it, tended to it, went to school, educated themselves in their field, sometimes that can be held against them. But even when you think of jury duty, I couldn't do jury duty because they're going to say you've been such a victim of something so brutal, you're automatically going to side with whoever you think the victim is and want to shame the bad guy because you've been a victim, right? And I would like to think that I'm educated enough and open-minded enough to be able to see both sides, but the courts are not going to take their chance on that. So I feel that maybe sometimes I feel like that could happen in so many aspects of the world, especially, I can say especially, but think like the mental health world. If a person like me came in and said, we need to focus on this, and what about this and this? There's someone that can say, you've been a victim of all these things. So of course you think this, and maybe it gets minimized a little bit. And so what I want to say to you is I think that maybe it is a blessing that you came in with the privilege of not having went through that. The fact that you have maintained the belief in a victim story, the fact that you trust the victim story, and that something is there, you know, and we're going to find it, man, thank you for that.
Yeah, my patients who have done this, to me, they are heroic. They have lived through things that fortunately, only it's a large minority, but only a minority of people have to experience. And they have somehow managed to recover from it and live through it and make lives for themselves. And I just have my heart go out to people with that level of heroic perseverance, yourself clearly among them. And I have so much respect for that, that how can I not do my professional best to help you recover from whatever issue it is that you're bringing to my office, whether it's mental or physical or both. And I also wanted to follow up on something you just said earlier about people who say, I didn't go through any traumas, I didn't have any childhood adversity, and then they proceed to tell you about all of their traumas and adversity. That has happened in a huge proportion of my patients who've been through, especially childhood adversity. Now, usually the adult traumas, people are very well aware about the fact that it was a big T trauma, but the childhood ones, when people look back, they'll often say, other people have been through worse than me and they seem to be okay. And I don't think it was that bad. One patient I remember very well, actually somebody known to the public who had probably half a dozen neuroplastic symptoms in different places in her body for 20 years. And when I went back to find out what adversity she'd had as a kid, which is so very prevalent in my patients, she said her parents used to fight each other verbally and emotionally. They didn't physically hit each other, but verbally and emotionally, there was a lot of violence in her home. She was the only child. She was the peacemaker. So very difficult challenge for her. But every time she told me about it and explained more detail, she said, but it wasn't that bad. So age 8, her parents divorce, and you would think, okay, that's going to solve her problem. She's going to go with one parent or the other, and they won't be fighting with each other anymore. But no, the parents kept living in the same house. They slept in separate bedrooms, but they kept living in the same house. So from her perspective, there was no improvement, no change.
Right.
And she had to keep on dealing with this for the next 10 years until she went off to university. And she just refused to believe that after probably 15 years of being a peacemaker, that it was that big a deal until I said, okay, you have this beloved niece, 6 or 7 years old. You adore this little girl. You take her shopping, you take her to amusement parks, you take her to the movies, you take her for the weekend. You just get along like brother and sister or sister and sister. What would you think if you were a butterfly on the wall of your childhood home and you had to watch this niece try to cope with your parents for, let's say, a week? What would that be like for you? And she just stared at me. And after a couple of minutes, she said, at the end of that week, I would shoot myself. And that was the first time she truly recognized the magnitude of what she had to cope with. And from there, I try to help her see there's heroic levels of perseverance going on there that you got through 15 years of that. And you have to respect that. That's where I try to help people with this, the pounding that they take to their self-esteem. I'm trying to flip that and help people look at this as if they had been parachuted into the Himalayas at age 3 and somehow had to deal, and to give themselves the respect that overcoming all that truly has been earned.
I think that we're just naturally groomed and trained to think that things end, right? That okay, mom and dad gets a divorce, so that means that the bad stuff is over. But that's not the case. And that's where like generational trauma and abuse comes into play. That leads to, unfortunately, it leads to people going to the route of suicide, going to addiction. There is, I will say that I have a very lovely life. I have an amazing family. I've always been loved. I've always been accepted. I always say that I did not know hate existed until 9 years ago when this man did this to me. I seen it on TV, but it was never part of my reality. And I could have went, I was so desperate. Sometimes to this day, I get so desperate to just have one day to not feel what I'm feeling. And there have been times I've thought, you know what? What if I just tried this one time? Just to have that one day. But I know that it's not just going to be one day. If I found a feeling that felt good, I'm going to want it the next day and the next day. And it's all temporary and it's going to lead to destruction. It's even what opened my mind to when I see someone on the side of the street holding up a sign that says, "We'll work for food." I've always been taught to never judge people like that. But of course, we still have those things in our heads of what'd you do to get here? You're probably on drugs, you're this and you're that. No one woke up and chose to do that. And day, I'm one day of feeling good because of something to be on the side of this corner with him. Give me one day of feeling good and I will repeat it over and over, and I'll be on the side of the street with that man. And so I don't judge them anymore. because I'm that desperate to feel good. And so for you to even recognize and say, you know what, there's some kind of heroic superpower in you for going. I work 8 to 10 hours a day, then I come home and podcast. I keep going. And so I appreciate you acknowledging that. It breaks my heart for these people. It breaks my heart for the community. I love what we're getting in a society with mental health, and that it doesn't mean that they're dangerous or bad people. I'm glad that we're going in the direction that we're going. I hate that it's taken so damn long and that we still have a bit of ways to
A
go.
long way to go. Yeah, my patients, many of them have been in such emotional pain and physical pain that they have had to resort to anything that will alleviate it. And some of that coping is toxic, and people know it's toxic, but they've reached a point where they feel like they have a few other options. And these include addictions, and not just to substances or alcohol or nicotine, but it can be behavioral addictions, gambling, shopping, sex, work, exercise is a common one, pornography for that matter, video games, even any kind of addiction, any kind of activity that you know is hurting you, but you can't stop. It's serving a purpose and it's providing some alleviation for that underlying physical or emotional pain. Eating disorders is another one. My patients who have suffered from eating disorders, either currently in my office or in the past, they are exerting control over their bodies and over what they put in their mouths at a time when usually they are in a state of emotional chaos and they are trying to control at least something, and the eating disorder provides that for them. So it's not something that anybody would resort to unless they were under enormous pressure. But how do people look at eating disorders and substance abuse and behavioral addictions? And cutting behavior is another one. They look at it as if people are behaviorally weak, that they are just people that are self-indulgent. They don't see the story behind it. And if they did, if they could live that person's life for a day or a week, most of us would be going, oh my God, I had no idea what this person is coping with today, and especially what they've had to cope with in the past.
Yeah. Wow, such a powerful conversation. So I keep a notepad with me and I write down questions. And there's a question that I have written, scratched out, rewritten, scratched out, and rewritten again.
It's going to be a good one.
And but here's the thing. Here's what I want to preface with. I am not a doctor. I know that you are brilliant enough to probably piece together what I'm trying to say to help make it make sense.
I'll
So
give it a shot, David.
yeah. So allow grace with that. But in the very beginning, when we started talking, you had mentioned the scans of the brain. And my question is, when there's these scans of the brain that alerts you that some part of the body has been traumatized, do you find there to be a difference when it comes to gender, age, when the trauma happened? Is there a difference in the location of this brain scan?
Yeah, that's a good question. Now, I don't think that research has been done. What they have looked at is if they compare somebody with fibromyalgia or a history of adversity in childhood or irritable bowel or certain social conditions that they manufacture in a research sense, condition called somatization disorder, which is just generally people having unexplained symptoms in their body. They find that there are differences in the parts of the brain that become active when you're experiencing pain. Differences compared to people who don't have these disorders. It's the research is by no means in its definitive stage at this point, but just the fact that these changes have been found, and in a couple of studies, that the changes can be at least partly reversed by neuroplastic psychology. That's, to me, very hopeful. That's why we call it a neuroplastic condition. The plastic refers to capacity for change. But yeah, there are a lot of fascinating questions. What produced these changes in the nervous system? What's the best way to reverse them? What actually are these changes in the brain responsible for? We know that they are processing signals from inside the body and causing us to interpret normal and healthy signals as being painful and dangerous. But how exactly did those changes get there? Does it vary from person to person by age or gender or race or sexual orientation? Any of those things, do they make a difference? And why does somebody who's been through adversity as a kid, why does one person get migraines and somebody else gets fibromyalgia? Or somebody else gets chronic fatigue or long COVID or bladder spasms or back pain is a big one. Lumbar spine pain is common, or visual disturbances or ringing in the ears. The list of symptoms goes into the hundreds that you can get from this. Why does one person who seems to have similar stressful background get a completely different symptom than somebody else who's got a similar level of stress or trauma? Lots of unanswered questions, but it all comes down to the fact that even without those questions being answered yet, we still have lots of hope that we know now and have shown in studies that we can help you get better.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I'm also getting from the answer that you gave me that just gives me chills is because there isn't this big way of seeing this big thing of it only happens this way in gay people, or only happens this way in women, it only happens this way in black men. None of that matters. It's happening that there's something that is pointing you all to this place in the brain, and everyone that's been tested, and it's related to trauma, which shows me that we are more alike than we are different, and that trauma affects us all. If there's one thing in the world that does not discriminate, it's trauma.
Yeah, there's no question about that. And in my own practice, I've got a pretty good sample with 7,000 plus people that have come through my office. And we are talking about a very diverse group if by the time you add all of them up. And the one thing that they had in common was that they had physical symptoms that were real, either pain or illness or both. Often they had more than one symptom at a time. So that was a unifying factor. The second was that there was some kind of stress going on, past or present. And the third was that they could get better. And sometimes the stress was very simple. It's just that physicians have not been trained to look for it. They're trained to look for organs and structures that have a problem, rather than a problem in life. One of my patients, he'd already been to several doctors. The only time he got pain was when he was driving to work. When he was driving home from work, he was fine. When he was not at work on the weekends, he was also fine. Gives you a clue there. You don't have to be a physician to figure out that, hey, maybe there's something going on in his office that isn't so good.
Yeah.
It turned out he'd been having symptoms for about 9 months. And it turned out that 9 months before I was seeing him, he was in a two-person office in a large corporation. 9 months ago, the partner in the office had been transferred 1,500 miles away to another office in the same company. So instantly, his workload doubled.
Mhm. Well, and we think that it's so easy for someone to say, well, dude, just quit your job. But I personally, myself, I'm so loyal and I need a paycheck. And there's all these other factors. Corporate America's job is to keep you in that corporate America place. And so, of course, it's so easy for me to say, dude, just quit your job and go to Target and get a job. But are you going to make the same amount of money at Target? Are you going to have the same benefits? Are you going to have to go 2 weeks without insurance, or how long without a paycheck? There's all these things that play into that keep you there in that place, that just keeps adding to those ailments that could be to a demise.
Yeah, he liked his job. He didn't want to leave, but
Yeah.
Once he saw the connection, though, then he was able to take steps. He went to his supervisor. He said, we need to make some changes here. They were having trouble hiring a replacement for his former partner. And he said, we need to offload me here somehow. And he made some arrangements. But just the mere fact of knowing where that pain was coming from, being able to use it as a signal that his brain was trying to communicate to him that it was in a state of distress. And to let the body be a form of language to let him know that changes needed to be made.
As we start coming to an end, although I feel like I could sit and talk to you all evening long, but I have found for myself, if I am feeling a certain type of way, I always want to give myself a day or two. You hear people say, as soon as I got to the doctor's office, I felt better. Or as soon as I got the test results that said that I had COVID, all of a sudden I feel better. I personally think, and I would love your opinion on this, but I think every time that I found myself being proactive, I would start feeling better. It's not that the elements were gone, the symptoms were gone. I don't know if it's just some kind of acknowledgement, some kind of control or what, but I would feel better. Just as simple as going to the doctor's office made me feel being proactive into what's going on with me, and I would feel better. Is there some kind of psychology behind that?
It's always going to be better to know what's wrong than not to know what's wrong. My patients, some of them have been unaware of what was going on, had no idea why they were ill or in pain for years sometimes. My patient who was a nurse, 79 years, that she didn't know why she was having these pains and nobody else did either. And it's tremendously unsettling to not have an explanation. You wonder if you're going crazy. You wonder if there's something dangerous happening in your body, if you're going to be permanently disabled by this. And that fear of what's happening in your body just ratchets up the stress and trauma that's going on, which then leads to more symptoms, which leads to more fear, and you're right into a vicious cycle. And by giving people a solid explanation for what's happening in their bodies, it just brings that whole fear level down. We can shift your attention from your body to what's happening in your brain. Use the physical symptoms as a form of communication from your brain that it's not happy with something, and we can focus on figuring out what that might be. And that just brings the whole stress level down. It brings the fear about what's happening in your body down, about the fear of the unknown comes down, makes a huge difference even before we figured out what the stress or trauma might be, because in many cases it takes a little while to assess for that. One other area that I think is important to mention for your audience is that many of my patients, either because of their childhood experience or because of a trauma later on, they deal with that by working very hard or by focusing on the needs of other people or both. And they end up living as if on a treadmill they never step off, and they end up not putting themselves on the list of people they take care of. And sooner or later, your body is going to protest. And my recommendation for people in that situation is to try to carve out some regular time every week, if possible, where you just have all the rest of your life get put on the shelf for a little while, and you just focus on activity that has no purpose but your own joy. And for a lot of my patients, they hear this from me and they're looking at me like, what would that be? Because they don't know. They've never done anything like that before. The idea of something for their own joy, many of them did not get sufficient opportunities to play as children because of the stress or trauma in their households took their attention away from what they should be doing as kids, which is playing. And so as adults, they don't know how to do that. One of my patients was a champion athlete as a girl, but she did her sport continuously, never starting at age 4. She never got to just be a carefree little girl. And so when I saw her, acute abdominal pain, and her lifestyle in her 30s was just nonstop. And there was no room for herself in her own world. So I just said, you've been living this way since you were 4. It needs to stop. And her husband was 100% behind it, thank goodness. And so she started taking a half a day off and just going for walks in a park. And that was all she could think of to do. She didn't know what fun was. But eventually, she came up with the idea of taking piano lessons. Never did anything musical before in her life. Absolutely loved it. Pain went away.
Yeah. It's that inner child. We had like a 2 or 3 part episode on just that inner child. And I always thought when I would hear inner child, I thought it was some corny, cliche, silly thing that therapists say. But then when I was actually like, oh, wait, like, oh, wow. And then I found those moments that the little David would peek out of the closet every now and then, but then I would shove him back in. And then now there are certain things that I do for that little David inside of me. And it is the best medicine. Like I'm even smiling now telling you about it. Like it is definitely healing.
Yeah, you have to get to it. A lot of my patients have to fight through some guilt when they're doing this because they feel like, hey, I could be doing so many useful, constructive things with this time. But all you're doing is you're giving to yourself what you've already been giving to everybody else in the world for so long. You deserve it. And once people learn this skill, and it is an essential human skill, once they have it for life, and whenever their brain starts talking to their body and making it hurt or have symptoms, now they will have an antidote. They will say, I know what's going on. My brain is distressed. It's making me feel it in my body. I'm going to put a stop to this right now because I'm going to go do my piano lessons or whatever the fun thing is.
Yeah. So let me ask you this first, Dr. Clark. I want to make sure that we cover every topic that you wanted to cover. Do you feel as if we covered everything? I'm not on a time frame. If there's something that we haven't, I'm more than happy to keep going.
Yeah, we know we've covered a, tremendous amount of ground. I really love the questions that you've put out there. I appreciate that very much. And I'm terrible about plugging my website, so I have to always remember symptomatic.me and start with the 12 question quiz. And it takes less than 3 minutes. And you're going to get, I spent days working on that thing, trying to pack as much information into less than 3 minutes for people because I know what the attention spans are on the internet. And starting there, you can begin a journey that's going to lead to a very good place.
And of course, I'm going to share all of that on our socials and everything too. I can't thank you enough for being here. Dr. Clark, I know that my podcast, we talk about a lot of hard things, right? But it's the hard things we have to talk about these things. But I always like to end on something fun. So I usually have a question or two that I ask someone, but the question I have for you just came to me through our conversation that I would like to end for us for me to ask you on to end on a fun note, which is the total opposite of what I was originally going to ask you. But we were talking about the importance of the inner child. So with you being so dedicated to your job, with you putting so many people before you, I'm sure at times before your family, what do you do for your inner child?
Oh, lots of things. I definitely learned from my patients the importance of this. And one of them, for over 20 years, I played on amateur soccer teams with a bunch of guys and sometimes on a co-ed team. And after being kind and compassionate to my patients all week, it was great to get out there and kick something.
Yeah.
And we just had a ball doing that. We'd go for a beer afterwards as a team. And only one or two of the team members were in the healthcare business. So it was a completely different group of people than I usually would hang out with. We had everyone from research scientists to firemen on those teams. And we just all, through our love of the game, just got along so well. I'm a little old for playing now because the leagues tend to be over 30, and I found myself playing against kids I had coached as a youth coach. So I eventually had to step down from playing, and I switched to playing with my grandchildren because they came along at about the same time. I've got five of those, and they keep me young. They range in age from 7 to 15, and they are just a nonstop a source of joy.
Yeah, I love that. Um, My goodness, I've really enjoyed this. I cannot wait to check out your website. I want to take that quiz. I We were talking about how being proactive in your health is a form of medicine. But I also would like to add to that is when you find someone that believes you, and that is another form of medicine. And so I'm so glad that we have you. I'm so glad that there are amazing doctors out there like you. And I can't wait to check out your website and anything that you put out. We're going to be following and listening to. So thank you
Thank you.
so much.
Yeah, thank you. We are trying to teach as many doctors as we can so that they can do this work. And because once they learn how, which is not hugely difficult, even I learned it, they love it. There was a family doctor that took me aside at a conference and said these ideas, now that she's learned them, had put the joy back into her work.
Yeah, yeah,
And that was just so rewarding to hear.
yeah. Remember, healing is a journey, not a destination.
You are not alone in this. It's okay to take your time, explore different perspectives, and find what resonates with you. Healing takes courage, and we believe in you.
Together, we can enjoy the ride.